Hi, everyone. Over the next few months and in the preceding weeks, I've been speaking to a number of people and organisations who do incredible work for animals, rescuing and caring for them and advocating for them within the community. Animal advocacy comes in so many forms. All of them play a vitally important role in protecting animals. Whether you're a rescuer, whether you're someone who stands at vigils, it doesn't matter. All of you play an important role. And today I'm chatting with Jo-Anne McArthur, an award-winning photographer and author. Through her long-term body of work, We Animals, which I'm happy to say sits on our front coffee table, and we point everybody who comes in our front door towards it. She's documented our complex relationship with animals around the globe. Since 1998, her work's taken her to over 60 countries, and in 2019, she founded We Animals Media. Jo was the subject of the critically acclaimed 2013 documentary, The Ghosts in Our Machine, which followed her as she documented the plight of abused and exploited animals and advocated for their rights as sentient beings. And there were some incredible images captured there, some very distressing images, which also must have been very hard on her as the person documenting them. Welcome, Jo. How are you, and how's everything been going over there in Canada through this really challenging time?
It is a really challenging time. 2020 just keeps throwing obstacles, doesn't it? And learning opportunities as well. I'm okay, but you did mention vigils. You said people are out there doing all sorts of good things to help animals, and you've probably heard the tragedy that happened here on my home turf on Friday when someone attending a vigil, Regan Russell is her name, and she's been attending vigils for years, and she was actually killed by a transport truck. And this is an interesting time for this to happen because ag-gag is now in our province. And I was actually wondering about ag-gag in Australia and what's happening there.
Sure. Well, we look, and the first thing I want to say about that whole scenario is that obviously the thoughts of the entire world of animal advocates and people who fight for the rights of animals are with Regan, her family, her friends, all of her associates, people that have known her over the years, including yourself. She was doing what so many of us have done, a whole heap of us have stood around the world at vigils and stood out the front of trucks. We've always gotten out the way, all those sorts of things. And there is always the potential for this sort of thing to happen. But by and large, truck drivers are quite respectful. They let us do our thing. And this is just a tragedy of enormous proportions. It sent shockwaves through all of us right throughout the entire world. And I don't ever like saying that horrible saying of that particular orange-coloured gentleman from just the south of you, thoughts and prayers. I believe in actions, and I hope the Canadian government and law enforcement investigate this to the fullest and take whatever actions are necessary in the fruit of their investigations. But look, it's interesting when you talk about ag-gag because we have an organisation, a non-government organisation here, as you would know, called Aussie Farms, who produced a map. Who produced a map which showed the locations of different animal agriculture industries around the country, and posted that online. Now, there was nothing unusual about that map. It basically was all the information was lifted off the Australian federal government's own website of locations, which is readily available publicly. You've just got to look for it. But Aussie Farms just made it a little bit more publicly available by putting it on social media. Now, this caused an absolute storm of controversy. And the federal government here reacted by passing laws very, very quickly that were quite draconian, that were very similar to the US laws, for instance, around fines, imprisonment, and all sorts of things, investigative powers. And that was quickly followed by, now we have a conservative federal government here in Australia, and that lead was quickly followed by all of the conservative governments in the state level in this country.
Swift.
Yeah, but here in Victoria, we don't. We have a progressive Labor or left-wing government, and they didn't have a knee-jerk reaction. What they did was to say, righto, let's see how this plays out. Let's not just jump on the bandwagon. So we had an inquiry that was launched by the National Party here, which is like the farmer party, if you like. It's the rural sector. They have one representative only in the chamber that I sit in, and she put forward this inquiry into the effect of animal rights activists on unauthorised farm access, I like to call it. So that was meant to be the nail in the coffin of animal activism in the state of Victoria. Unfortunately for them, it backfired on them. Yeah, it backfired on them, and the bulk of the people who made public submissions, the bulk of the people who came as witnesses, were all people from animal activism or NGOs involved in animal advocacy, and they presented the case of enormous amounts of animal cruelty that actually are common practice in the animal agriculture industries, as you would well know. And so it backfired. So the recommendations that came out of that inquiry were actually more so based around improving the practices and making them more transparent so the public can actually make informed decisions for themselves. That they got very upset because they were searching for fines, for instance, and imprisonment terms that would have been mandatory in the terms of tens of thousands of dollars, even hundreds of thousands of dollars, and also mandatory prison terms in some instances. And what they got was a $500 on-the-spot fine was the maximum thing that they could have.
Okay.
So it backfired on them greatly. So I'm happy to say that that was a great achievement on behalf of the animal advocacy groups here in Victoria, and it is distressing and somewhat concerning to hear that Canada, who we consider quite a progressive country in many ways, to be actually going down that same heavy-handed path.
It's so unfortunate that we have to spend our valuable and limited time and resources as animal advocates fighting this nonsense. Just institutionalized protection of institutionalized cruelty. So it's problematic on so many levels, and also with the death of Regan Russell, it affords drivers, like, I don't know the name of that driver, but a certain amount of protection with regards to injuring and killing people, so they can be found not liable because we are there, even on public land, protesting, and we do have the right. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but our Charter of Rights and Freedoms says that we do have the right to peacefully protest, and especially on public property. And these truckers know that their trucks are extremely dangerous, and nevertheless, this man drove quickly into Regan. And so we're going to see how this plays out in the courts. And that's something that's being sorted out this week. We're wondering who the key players are going to be in terms of bringing this to court, but also making sure that this is getting the media attention that it deserves. This can't just be seen as an incident. At first the media was reporting on this as like a bystander, or not a protester, but a pedestrian. They said a pedestrian was struck down. It's like, that's not at all what was happening here. So we have a lot of work to do, and it is tragic, and these trucks are dangerous. So everyone who's out there doing the wonderful work of bearing witness and going to these vigils, we know to be careful, but please, all of you, be extra careful.
Absolutely, and I refer to that, that documentary, the name of it, the Ghost in Our Machine. This is exactly what you're up against here. Now, when we start to see this investigation and as it plays out through the courts, you are now up against a very large machine that has a lot of monetary resources, who will try and paint this in a particular light, who will have the most expensive lawyers. They will have this enormous amount of backing, and we can only hope that and have faith in the Canadian legal system that, that old saying, the truth will out.
Hope so. And, speaking of this, that's what animal advocacy is, really. It's quite an uphill battle, isn't it, for all of us? I mean, whether we're in law or policy or frontlining, vegan advocacy, we're still a minority, as you know. And but we're still on the right side of history. We are still creating incredible momentum, and we have the truth on our side. animals are incredible, sentient, and complex beings, and as we know, they deserve our protection and our respect, and they deserve to live free from harm. And it's hard work, but it's good to be doing this work.
Absolutely, and it is, and I think it's extremely important that when we have people who are high profile, who have a platform, and clearly I'm speaking of people like Joaquin Phoenix here, but not just him, but people who are, whether we like it or not, we are in the age of celebrity, and when celebrities have a platform, I think they do have, to a certain extent, a moral obligation to use that platform to put positions on the table and to create conversations on a whole host of issues, moral, social issues that affect everyone, and that can be. It can be veganism. It can be about the injustices that face all animals on this planet, but it can also be about refugees. It can be about so many things. They have such an enormous platform that's just sitting there, and that they can influence. They can influence policy by influencing public opinion, and I think they have an obligation to do so.
Yes, I hope everyone hears that. That's great. Good call to action. And you mentioned Joaquin, and it's so exciting that we have him writing the foreword for my new book, which is called Hidden. We actually have some Aussie contributors to that book, and so right now I think it stands at 34 photojournalists, animal photojournalists. And this is an indictment. It's a 5-pound tome of a historic book about what is and what should never again be. And I feel quite fortunate that we have Joaquin lending his voice to the project as well.
Well, we'll come back to that in just a couple of minutes, because I do want to touch on that. But look, coming back to, I guess, your body of work in that respect, so often with words it can be hard to give a situation or an issue justice. How do you accurately describe what an animal is going through and ensure readers connect with that animal and their suffering? This is why within the animal rights movement, photography plays such an important and powerful role. In one moment, you can capture your audience and elicit understanding, thoughts and emotions that words often struggle to do. Can you share with us what initially drew you to photography and why you believe it plays such an important role in animal advocacy?
Sure. There's a lot to discuss there. We could probably just stay on that for the next hour. The role of photography and how to take poignant pictures. We know that images are an important piece of the puzzle when it comes to animal liberation and justice and equality, because images reach people very, very quickly, much more than a report can. And for me, the most successful images are one that show something about the animal's experience. So, in typical animal photography, historically, we have animal portraits and we have wildlife photography and pet photography. But it's interesting, this evolution of animal photojournalism, because it's serving the animal more. It's telling an in-depth, newsy, political, timely story. And we're seeing a big boom in that right now, which animals really, really need. And so those images are more not just about a pretty picture, but about context, and the context in which we, the problem causers of everything, put animals. That's why you'll see in my We Animals images, rarely will you see a portrait. You'll see the locks and the chains, the constructs, the captivity, because that's what we need to confront. We have to see those things, and they are all around us. And yet we fail to see those details. We don't want to consider those details, because then we have to face our complicity in the consequences and in the suffering of others. But that's what We Animals media draws attention to. Yeah,
and it's just incredible work there. And I often look at, I find myself always going back to that original book and flipping through those pages. And I often think, and I just want to tie this in with what we were talking about before with celebrities, with platform. I grew up, as a lot of people did, our talking about photography and images and film with Sunday nights at home, we would have the nature specials on the television, and it'd be David Attenborough, and it'd be the African animals, the lion attacks the zebra, and we would think, oh gosh, that's violent, but that's just nature. And I often think, well, David Attenborough has been such an enormous educator in his TV specials and documentaries and things. I'd love to see him, and he's been such a loud advocate lately on climate change, for instance. I would love to see David Attenborough produce a TV documentary about the atrocities that face farm animals. And I think someone with the respect that he has around the world, if he were to do something like that, I think the effect would be enormous.
I agree. And it's interesting that you bring up how we were taught to see animals and think about animals. And quite often it's these animals over there, exotic animals, and look what's happening in the wild. And it's so distant from us, but our relationship with animals is anything but distance. We have a very close relationship with animals, and because we eat them, like we're literally putting other animals in our bodies every day, and we're wearing them, and we're using medicine that's tested on them. So yeah, it's really far removed from the animals we see on BBC. And it would be great to have Attenborough's voice, but we have a lot of other people's voices.
We do.
Yeah, the movement's growing.
We do. And look, and you've had yourself so many incredible experiences. Many of those, no doubt, are also extremely challenging for you when you're seeing firsthand that immense suffering that humans inflict on animals. Can you share with our listeners one of those experiences and the impact it had on you and the role that you believe it played in helping animals?
Well, it is always painful and challenging because I don't get to help the animals that I'm photographing. Over the last 20 years, I've met millions of animals, and that may seem impossible. But when you consider that sometimes I'll spend a day at a broiler farm, broilers, the euphemism for, of course, chickens raised for meat, and there might be 900,000 birds at this one place. So I have met millions upon millions of animals, and I wish that I would be able to help all of them, or even a few of them. But my role is to try my best to convey what their experience might be in the constructs that we put them in, the buildings and the cages. And so it is painful and upsetting. But I did actually learn something interesting recently during a meditation retreat, and the Buddhist monk who is a vegan activist, and he was our teacher, he was talking about the difference between empathy and compassion. And we as activists pride ourselves on being very empathetic, and some of us are led to animal activism because we are empathetic by nature. But he said that empathy often leads to burnout because where empathy is to put yourself in someone else's place. And to really feel what they're feeling, whereas compassion is a lot more constructive. It gives you a little bit more space, and you can bring a lot to it without being totally drained. So he did get us to think a lot about empathy versus compassion. He felt that compassion was a lot more productive and allowed us to work as activists for the long term. But I didn't answer your question though, but you go ahead.
No, it does because it sounds like really good advice, because it is an answer to the question in many ways, because the question was phrased because what was in my mind about it was that you have to go into these terrible places, you take these images of terrible suffering, and you have to walk away. And that would be the hardest possible thing, because the empathetic nature of all of us wants to open up all those cages and to take as many of those chickens or minks, or name the animal, it doesn't matter. We want to take them with us as much as possible, and that's not necessarily the compassionate side of us. That's that empathetic side of us that wants to save them, that wants to take them in and give them this wonderful cuddle and erase all their suffering. And I was wondering, and that's why that question was set around that way. I was wondering what you do for your self-care, because the toll that there must be an enormous amount of of hurt that builds up inside of you from having to go into these places, from documenting, and that builds and builds and builds. That having to walk away, it must take a terrible toll on you emotionally.
Well, it did when I didn't have so much experience, and I didn't know what to do with those emotions. And now I compartmentalize in a healthy way, not in a bad way that's going to give me cancer. It's like, I can only do my best every day, and I have to focus on that. So I've learned to focus on the change that I can create every day, and to be happy with that. That's the best I can do. Why torture myself? I used to torture myself, and I would have, pigs and hens and all these animals on my mind all the time, but it was draining my energy. Yes, animals are suffering by the billions right this moment because of us, but like, what can I do about it? I can do my best every day. So, that's not acceptable to everyone. And I know that empathy is also something to be nurtured and protected, but I think used in moderation or used in a calculated way. Yeah. And
Oh, I think you said it well there when you said you can do your best every day. If we all did our best every day, the cumulative effect of that would be absolutely enormous. It'd be a tidal wave of compassion.
And we, now at this point in history, 2020, like what a crazy year. But how much more proof do we need? This pandemic caused by us, there are bushfires caused by us. How much more proof do we need that we all just need to step up and put others ahead of ourselves, and have a close look at our selfishness, and have a close look at, or a critical look rather, at how we engage with the world and why. Often we eat meat, but it's because we were brought up that way, and we're part of the carnist ideology. And we think vegetarianism is an ideology, but really carnism is as well. It's just the ingrained one, so we can't really see it. And so we need to think about those things. We need to think about also racism and white privilege, which is a huge topic right now, thank goodness. And so it's really about thinking critically and supporting one another, and thinking critically and listening. And now's the time. My gosh.
Yeah. Well, look, we could do an entire program, and I think you've actually given me a really good idea. I think that, and I'll speak to my team about it. I think we could do like a panel program on the whole thing of the moral and ethical problem that the world faces in terms of why we're eating what we're eating, and how it's now we're reaping the results of that with every zoonotic disease that we think come out, and they're different iterations.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, let's not get into that now. Look, another experience, if I changed that completely, then was when you, was no doubt extremely challenging, was when you came out to Australia recently during the bushfires earlier this year. Can you just give us a description of what you saw, what your experience was like?
Yeah, I think the prevailing memory and experience for me was the lack of access and the lack of help. And so a team and I spend, thousands of kilometers on the road just trying to get to the places where animals needed help. Me, and of course, in a documentary capacity, along with veterinary teams. And the lack of government, no, not lack of government access, but like the lack of access that anyone is given. I understand that because they're trying to protect people from injury, I guess, especially because of, was it Black Saturday from a decade ago? Yeah, a lot of people were injured, and they just, the government from state to state is like, okay, no, we're just going to block access everywhere. But to the great detriment of the individuals, the non-human animals who are in there, the koalas who are up in trees starving, and animals that needed medical attention. So it was pretty depressing to see that the country could not, or was not organized to mobilize quickly. And time is of essence when there's an emergency like that. So, and I hate to point the finger, that's not what I want to do in my work. There are travesties going on everywhere. In every country that I go to, there are things happening. But, you did ask me about Australia, and I think,
absolutely.
Again, yeah. And I think what NGOs are learning, and what veterinarians are learning, and a lot of people are learning, is that, okay, to a large degree, we have failed the animals. We were not there in time for them. Some animals were rescued and given vet care, but not many. And so that needs to change. And people, we all need to be prepared for the next bushfires, which might be around the corner for all we know it. Hey.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And look, it's a really important point that you make there. It's yes, it's about what happened, but the next and very equal part of that conversation is, well, what's our response? If we determine that we didn't do the right thing, what is our response from that point on? And that's a policy response. So what I did was I brought a bill, a private member's bill, to the chamber to create a new authority called Wildlife Rescue Victoria, because it recognised that this was a terrible, terrible situation, and that because rescuers, qualified people with decades of experience who had the necessary accreditation to be on fire grounds, were denied access for weeks. So animals that were viable, who could have been rescued, had their injuries treated, would have died unnecessarily and in painful and starvation circumstances. Now, that's unacceptable. So that's why I brought that bill. And I'm happy to say, you might not have heard, but I'm happy to say that the government have come to the party on this. They've recognised that they got it wrong. And we are now having a series of roundtables where everyone will be brought in to establish what actually happened. How do we go going forward? And everything is on the table in that discussion, including having a full public inquiry and the setting up perhaps of a brand new authority, which is what we need, separate from government, that's part of the response, that as soon as something happens, as soon as there's an emergency declared, wildlife incident controllers are in the room, along with fire service personnel, along with everybody. So the response from volunteers who are qualified and trained is ready to go when they are needed. That's what's required. So that's policy response to a live on the ground situation. It's not in play yet. It's early stages, but the government have at least have recognised that they got it wrong.
I'm really, really happy to hear that. And you've mentioned the people who were just gung-ho to get out there into the field. I mean, they were everywhere, weren't they? Everyone was talking to one another. How do we do this? How do we just get out there? How do we execute? Or if we are there to offer vet care, where can the animals go next? Like, there needed to be a whole chain of rescue and care and sanctuary, and the dots were not connecting. And I know everyone realizes that, and so I'm glad that that conversation is happening on a policy level. It's great news.
Well, I've got two more questions for you, and the first one is, and again, I always say to people when I'm doing public speaking that I'm a graduate of the Billy Connolly School of Public Speaking. We start out in one point, we go on a big circle, but we always end up coming back.
It's a conversation. I like that.
Yeah. Well, we spoke earlier about the new book that you've got coming out, and that's something that I'm really looking forward to, that you co-edited with Keith Wilson, called Hidden Animals in the Anthropocene. Can you please tell our listeners a bit about the book, and when will it be available in Australia, more importantly?
Okay. Keith Wilson is an Aussie, by the way, I will say, and he's a journalist who's been focusing on photography worldwide for a really long time. So he's a great co-editor. We also have a National Geographic, Washington Post designer, David Griffin. So we have a really strong team. This book came together because, with We Animals Media, we just want to continue to amplify the stories of animals in various ways. And when images are on social media, I mean, they can only go so far. Yes, they might go viral for a bit, but we want to create documents that are a little more historic, that have staying power, and that get under the noses of different audiences. And so this is something that we can get out to influential people. And when you produce something that big, like, this is literally a monster book, it's 5 pounds. When you produce something that substantial with that many contributors, it's a conversation point. So it's not that the book itself physically is going to change the world, but it's going to create a hell of a lot of conversation. And so it's strategic. It's all, like We Animals Media, we're very strategic now. It used to be just me running around with a camera to all corners of the globe, because I'm interested in everything that's happening with animals. But very strategic now. And
Fantastic.
we actually have a wonderful publishing partner in Australia with the group Animals Australia. So they have signed on to help with the book. and help specifically with the shipping costs, especially to your country, which is very far away. And,
Yes.
and this is a 5-pound book. And I think like hundreds of you guys have ordered this book, which is fantastic. A lot of activists and animal engaged people in Australia, I'll say.
Well, what I'll do is I'll get you to send through, email me all the links for ordering and all those sorts of things, and some images if you would, and I'd be more than happy to promote the book on my pages to make sure. Let's see if we can't take those orders from hundreds to thousands.
Thank you.
Because then we can, the more people that see these images and the stories of these animals, the better. Look, Jo, I'll probably be getting the wind up very shortly, and I can imagine that that Miranda would be sitting off on the side, looking at tapping her watch and trying to give me the wind up. But if you could leave our listeners with one thought today, what would it be?
Well, now you know that I take pictures to make the world a better place, but that's because that's my skill and my passion. And we all have different skills and passions. And I think that whatever you're good at in the world, you should use that skill to make the world a better place for all, for the environment, for animals, for people. Whether you're interested in the arts or sciences or sports, anything you're interested in, you can curb that toward making the world a kinder place. And that, I guess, goes out especially to young people who are thinking about how to find their way in the world. Things are dire, as you know, and we all need to step up. And so also, if you're doing something that you enjoy doing and that you're good at, you'll have longevity in it and a passion for continuing to do it.
Fantastic. Look, thanks so much for joining us and talking about everything today. It's been absolutely amazing. And look, keep seeing your Buddhist monk, because it's clearly going to help you get through, because we need you to keep going. This world and the animals, the non-human animals in it particularly, and need people like you to continue doing the work that you do to expose all of these terrible situations that they live in on a day-to-day basis, and hopefully we can then all learn and we can all make our little part of changing the world come about.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, mate. Stay safe.
Andy, thanks for what you're doing as well. Really, it's just great to see you out there in the world, speaking up with such a strong voice for animals.
Oh, cheers, mate. Stay safe.
Okay.
Bye now.
Bye.